Is this outrageous enough for you? All this in a Hemi engine too? Welcome to the story of Chrysler's winged wonders. If there were ever two cars built for one purpose, these were the cars: the Dodge Daytona and the Plymouth Superbird. Their purpose was to win races for Chrysler Corporation on tracks like Talladega, Daytona, and Charlotte. These factory race cars, with their streamlined noses and high spoilers, could achieve frightening speeds on the high banking. With the Chrysler Hemi engine under the hood, which had horsepower to burn, there seemed to be no limit to how fast these cars could go.
These wing cars were really the bullets of the racetrack. They dominated the races, no question. Very few cars could outrun them.
Dodge was first out of the box with the Daytona in mid-year 1969. It was their answer to the new aerodynamically styled Ford Torino Talladega and the Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 2. The Dodge Daytona wasn't the product of a design studio. It had its birth in the race shops.
The Charger 500 and the Daytona were designed by the racers. Styling had nothing to do with the car. When the final product was shown to styling, they called it an abomination. When the Superbird rolled around, it was a year later, styling was involved to enhance the overall package.
The Superbird and Daytona were two different cars, but at 200 miles per hour, it was awfully hard to tell them apart. These cars were proof that Chrysler Corporation loved to build and race fast cars. The stock car racing rule said everything that raced on Sunday had to be available at the dealerships on Monday. So thanks to Chrysler's desire to win on Sunday, muscle car fans made out like bandits. You could actually own one of these, but you had to act fast because Chrysler only intended to make about 2,500 of them, just enough to qualify as stock cars under NASCAR's rules. The Daytona and the Superbird are today among the rarest muscle cars ever made. Collector groups estimate that almost 1,000 of these cars remain today, an astonishing survival rate of almost 50%. Obviously, car collectors recognized from the very start that these cars were special. Thanks to racing rule changes and the prevailing mood of the early 70s, the Daytona and the Superbird disappeared from the racetracks and the showrooms almost as fast as they appeared. But during the short 18-month period we now call the Aero Wars, there was no better example of the extremes to which Chrysler's gearhead engineers were willing to go to win races.
Chrysler certainly outperformed everybody else. Ford was competitive, but really the 60s NASCAR belonged to Chrysler.
The Superbird and Daytona were aerodynamics taken to the extreme. But aero cars, of one kind or another, actually started showing up at the racetracks years earlier. We'll pick up our story at the beginning of the Aero Wars when the American muscle car returns. There wasn't much science to stock car racing in its early days. Basically, the sport was about staying on the track for the length of the race. Fine points like aerodynamics took a back seat to just keeping the engine running and keeping the wheels on. Nonetheless, some racers did discover that things like rolling up the windows and taping over the headlights made a small difference, particularly on longer tracks. As stock car racing graduated from the half-mile bull rings and the dirt tracks to the super speedways, drivers and mechanics were beginning to deal with space-age concepts like slipstreaming and downforce. Gary Romberg is a Chrysler engineer who helped bring aero technology into stock car racing.
I've been with Chrysler Corporation since 1961. When I came to Chrysler, I was assigned basically to NASA in Huntsville, Alabama, doing the aerodynamics of space launch vehicles. In the late 60s, this job opened up in Detroit in race aerodynamics. So I took that job and I walked right in at the time when the Superbird and Daytona were being developed.
One of the first attempts at creating a bumper-to-bumper aero package was the 1966 Dodge Charger. Its fastback roofline was supposed to make the air flow more smoothly over the car, giving it greater speed and stability. Unfortunately, the Charger looked a lot better than it ran. David Pearson won the first of his 3 Grand National Driving Championships that year in a Dodge, but not a Dodge Charger.
In '66, I drove a Charger at Daytona, and we thought that was going to be the tip, the car to run on the super speedways, but we felt like it wouldn't after we ran it. We went back to the regular 2-door. Then it seemed like it did better on the super speedways than even the Charger did.
Despite its lackluster performance on the racetrack, by 1969, the Dodge Charger had become a street favorite. The second-generation Charger's blend of luxury and power and one of Chrysler's most distinctive body styles wasn't just popular with the muscle car crowd, the car also had a lot of aero potential. When the Dodge teams showed up at the racetrack at the beginning of the '69 season, they brought a car that looked like the '69 Charger, but with a few aerodynamic improvements. Dodge called it the Charger 500. It had a flush grille and a redesigned rear deck with an almost horizontal rear window. Again, it wasn't exactly what they were hoping for.
We weren't doing very well on the track, so we brought out the Charger 500. We still didn't do very well on the track. We had taken our engine technology about as far as we could at that particular time, and so we asked the aerodynamics people, of which I was one of them, to be able to develop a car body that would get through the air quicker and faster and better than our Charger 500. Out of that work came the Dodge Daytona.
This was the Dodge Daytona. The car was a product of months of development by Chrysler's engineers working with the racing teams. Harry Lee Hyde, son of NASCAR crew chief Harry Hyde, remembers how the race teams were introduced to the Daytona.
The original ones were built at Nichols Engineering. Chrysler had developed this thing. They built the original ones there for a pattern for us to go by. We brought this one back and revamped all the rest of the cars to this car.
All the Charger 500's good parts, like the fastback rear window, showed up on the Daytona. Plus, a couple new features that were hard to miss.
This car you see here is basically the same thing as the D500, only the nose part was changed in the front, and the front configuration right over top of the tires. The wing was added to the rear for a more stable downforce, plus that wing was up in a lot cleaner air than what a spoiler would be.
It was that nose and that outrageous rear wing that aroused the most attention, particularly after the car rolled onto the new Talladega racetrack for the first time and shattered the speed record.
The average speed was hitting 205, 210 in a draft. We ran 201 with it, just in normal qualifying trim.
Dodge now had the car that could dominate at Talladega and all the other speedways. But before the Daytona could go racing, there was the little matter of NASCAR's minimum production requirements. We'll tell you that story when the American Muscle Car returns. Building 20 racing Daytonas was easy. Building 500 Daytonas for the street was hard, even though the car was mostly '69 Charger. Restorer John Aruza explains some of the things that had to be done to make a Charger into a Daytona.
The nose cone is sheet metal. The headlight doors are fiberglass. They just used a 70 model Charger fender and hood because the 70 model Charger was going to come out with the wraparound bumper, which gave perfect place to line up the nose cone.
The little bumps on the Daytona's fenders served an important purpose too.
Chrysler had holes in the tops of the fenders to release air trapped in the front fenders at high speed. They really didn't want the Ford camp or the Chevy camp to realize that that's what they were for, so they came up with the story that the tires were rubbing and they needed to cut a hole in the fender for the tire. Well, that was actually not the case. They really did speed the car up by releasing trapped air from inside the fender.
Race car design can interfere with street car functionality. In these situations, Dodge had to make a few compromises, as wing car authority David Paddock shows.
When these cars were originally engineered, this little wing was way down here. Problem with that was no way to open the deck lid. So the engineers raised the wing, and deck lid opens, barely clears the wing.
There were no compromises under the hood, though, and there weren't many choices either. The short list of engines included two 440 cubic inch torque monsters, or the magnificent 426 Hemi. Two transmissions were available, Chrysler's 727 Torque Flight Automatic, or their heavy-duty 4-speed. Sure grip rear ends were standard, completing what was one of the most unbreakable powertrains ever assembled. Chrysler's records show that 503 Charger Daytonas were made. But according to Dr. Don Tarr, a Chrysler factory race driver, only about half of these actually made it to the Dodge dealers.
The story I got, there was supposed to have been 500 built and counted, and after they did that and they found out there were only about 250 left, they had torn a lot of them down and sent them away to the race car teams and to use for parts. And when NASCAR found out about that, they got a little upset.
There's a great story about how they were supposed to build, I believe, 500 units. And they had the NASCAR people there inspecting at the plant, and they were just rolling cars back in and back in and back in. So there's no telling how many times they looked at the same car and didn't know it.
NASCAR knew that racing was more fun and ticket sales were more brisk when everybody played. So the Daytona was pronounced legal, and the world turned its eyes toward Talladega, where these new cars promised to go faster than ever before. So fast, in fact, that some people were looking for ways to slow this thing down. But there were problems at the new Talladega racetrack, and the Aero cars were the cause. Up and down pit row, Ford and Chrysler teams alike were dealing with the effects of increased speed and downforce, as David Pearson recalls.
Goodyear was having trouble with the tires because we never had run that fast and never had that much pressure on the car or the tires going through the corner. And they was coming apart and blowing a lot of tires. And so there was quite a few of us drivers felt like it was unsafe.
A proposal by the drivers to postpone the race 1 week until better tires were available was denied. So most of the top-named drivers, David Pearson among them, chose to sit the race out.
And France wouldn't do it. He said, no, we're going to run the race, this week. And so he's a little hard-headed, and we was too. And so some of us drivers got together and said, well, if he's going to do that, if he thinks that much about it, let's just don't run.
Without many of NASCAR's top-named drivers, the first Talladega 500 was run on schedule, with a field made up mostly of short-track drivers and smaller cars. A few of the factory cars were entered with substitute drivers. A Dodge Daytona driver, Richard Brickhouse, won the race, which featured none of the usual excitement, and thankfully, no calamities from blown tires.
But they went ahead and ran the race, and they didn't have any trouble. Everything come out all right.
By the end of the 1969 season, the race teams and the tire companies were learning to deal with the byproducts of aerodynamics, and Dodge's Daytona had made a name for itself in competition.
We won 17 races in 1969, but did not win the championship.
Going into 1970, the wing was the thing on the high bank track. And this year, Plymouth was going to get their own Aero Warrior, the Superbird. Stand by as America gets its first glimpse of Plymouth's winged wonder. on the American muscle car. Stacked against the Daytona's 17 wins in 1969, Plymouth's 2-win season had been a disaster. As soon as they saw the Dodge Daytona on the track, Plymouth's aero team knew what they had to do. The Roadrunner was one of America's most beloved street muscle cars, but in aero terms, it was a shoebox. It was, however, the no-brainer choice to be the platform for Plymouth's wing car. The Roadrunner and the Charger shared Mopar's B-body platform, so most of the swoopy parts that had to be made for the Daytona would work on the Roadrunner with a little massaging. To make the nose cone fit, the Superbird used the Dodge Coronet front fenders and hood. Its wing had larger uprights and was raked back at a more extreme angle. The Superbird differed from the Daytona in one other way. There were going to be more of them. This year, NASCAR upped the production quota to 1 car for every 2 dealerships. This meant almost 2,000 Superbirds would soon show up at Plymouth dealers all over America. Smith Stokes, a young Plymouth dealer in 1970, remembers his eagerness to get a Superbird as his demonstrator model.
Well, in 1970, I got a brochure that came through the mail from Chrysler announcing they were going to put a wing car in racing, and we heard rumors Richard Petty would be back with a car. I anxiously ordered one. In fact, we just looked at the order blank a minute ago over here, and I discovered I actually phoned the order in. I was so excited.
Plymouth was committed to making 4 times as many Superbirds as there were Dodge Daytonas. Faced with having 2,000 expensive, outrageous mobiles hanging around their lots that they couldn't sell, they planned from the beginning to make the cars very buyer-friendly. Like the Daytona, the Superbird's standard engine was the romping 440 cubic inch Super Commando with 1 Carter AVS 4-barrel carburetor. This engine had a 9.7 to 1 compression ratio and made 375 horsepower at 4,600 RPMs and 480 foot-pounds of torque at 3,200 RPMs. You could opt for the 6-barrel version of this engine, which made 390 horsepower and up the torque to 490 foot-pounds. Or you could luck into one of the 93 Superbirds produced with a 426 Street Hemi, which weighed in at 425 horsepower and 510 foot-pounds of torque. The Hemi was an $841 option, but with this engine, you didn't run with the big dogs, you were the big dog. Many of the Roadrunner's performance options were available on the Superbird, like 15x7 rally wheels, and F60 15 white letter tires, and the Sure Grip rear end. All Superbirds featured front disc brakes as standard equipment. In addition, the Superbird could be a pretty fancy ride, with an optional 8-track player, custom steering wheel, console, gauges, and other dress-up equipment. With a base price of $4,298, the Superbird was a big-ticket item. Just a few options could price this car out of reach of most muscle car buyers. Sharon Malcolm was a Plymouth dealer in 1970 who had no luck selling the 1 Superbird at her dealership.
We had 1 Toro Red Superbird, and it seemed like that no one wanted the cars with the wings on them. And we'd had the car 6 months, and they came to us and wanted us to pay the car off, and we didn't have the money. So I had to go to the bank and borrow the money to pay that Superbird off just in order to get it off my floor plan.
Superbirds might not have been moving very quickly on the sales floor, but they were moving like lightning on the racetrack. We'll check back in with the race teams when the American Muscle Car returns. As the 1970 racing season took the green flag, it was apparent that it was going to be a good year for the cars with the wings. The Petty Blue Plymouths were in the winner's circle immediately, winning the Daytona 500 to start the season. Not to be outdone, Dodge driver Buddy Baker set a new world's record of 200.447 miles per hour at Talladega. But once again, The combination of exotic race engines and wind tunnel aerodynamics were sending speeds through the roof, with no end in sight. Clearly, something had to be done to make sure NASCAR racing was a safe show.
You got to worry about fan safety as much as your driver safety. These cars could have very well been hitting 240 to 250 pretty quick had NASCAR have not got a hold on it before then.
By August, NASCAR was ready with a plan to slow things down.
During 1970, they removed the side glass from the cars to slow them down. They did some other things to try to put a cap on this.
Slowing the cars down was a start, but what NASCAR really wanted was for all these trick body styles to go away and to get back to racing more conventional cars.
Bill France, I don't think, was too happy to see these cars. I think he had an idea of wanting to keep his stock car racing series a little less exotic than some of the other series. He wanted the cars to look like what you and I would drive on the street at the time.
From 1971 on, the wing cars would carry a lot more weight around the racetrack or run a tiny little 305 cubic inch engine. These handicaps were too much even for cars like the Superbird and the Daytona. They disappeared from the racetracks overnight. So few of these cars were ever built that it's rare to see one today, except at gatherings like the Aero Warriors Reunion at the International Motorsports Hall of Fame at Talladega. When wing car lovers get together, they share a very special fellowship.
If you're a Mopar person, you know what B5 blue is, you know what A4 silver is, and all the different colors of the cars. And so, you know, you get this talk. You kind of get the Mopar talk.
The Daytona and the Superbird were a short but unforgettable blip on the automotive radar screen. Thanks to the restorers, there are a few left today to remind us of the days when car companies were willing to be outrageous just to win races. Thanks for watching, and remember, don't crush them, restore them.